I'm Rob Tracinski. This is Salon of the Refused, where we talk about ideas that are outside the mainstream. My guest today is Helen Pluckrose, the editor of Areo magazine and co-author with James Lindsay of the new book, Cynical Theories. Thanks for coming on, Helen.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Now, describe the book a little bit. There's a longer subtitle that sort of describes what Cynical Theories refers to.
Yeah, the book sort of traces the development and the evolution of a few core ideas from postmodern thought from the late 1960s to right now. We argue that certain ideas about objective knowledge, about society being constructed in systems of power and privilege, about the importance of language for constructing reality, the dismantlement of boundaries, the cultural relativism and the loss of the individual, and where these ideas came from, the original sort of French postmodernists, particularly Michel Foucault, and how they have evolved into what we are now calling social justice scholarship and activism.
So, the culture war of the moment is all about wokeness and cancel culture. And I almost feel old for calling it political correctness, because that was sort of the favorite term of the 1990s. But there's this whole culture war debate over that's going on right now. What you're doing really is tracing the philosophical roots of that.
Yeah, and it's very particular ideas. It's really better even, I think, than philosophy to describe it as a concept of the world and society. It's this, underlying it all is this idea that knowledge is a construct of power, that we can't see these power structures very well, but certain powerful sources in society get to decide what is and isn't knowledge. Then these ways of talking about things get legitimized. Everybody talks this way, and it maintains these power structures.
Yeah, one of the things I found most useful about the book is that these are theories that require a certain amount of translation. I mean, my background is in philosophy, and I remember what I like to say is, for example, reading Immanuel Kant is a little bit like being the guy who discovered how to decode Egyptian hieroglyphics, right? You have these very complex, and that's very true of the postmodernists. They have all these terms of capitalized terms. Social justice and theory are capitalized because they mean something special, and all sorts of sort of arcane jargon, which I think is to some extent deliberate.
Yeah, that was certainly in the first sort of two generations of it, really. In the 1960s, when we had Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard, for example, then there was a certain need for an ambiguity of language, because central to the theory was the idea that language could not straightforwardly convey meaning. So it was used quite loosely. There were a lot of neologisms and terms just used in different ways from how they were understood. Then in the late 1980s and early 90s, when the sort of branches that we know now as critical race theory and queer theory and post-colonial theory really sort of took off, that continued to a certain extent in most of them. Particularly, I mean, Judith Butler and Homi Bhabha have won the worst sentence competition. So because they really are, you just have to interpret an awful lot of it. But critical race theory didn't really do that. It was always quite clear. And this is what we're seeing a dominance of at the moment. So if you read the two most influential books on race, which are sort of forming the social justice position, Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, you'll find they're very, very easy to read.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about how there's been sort of I think you call it a mutation of the theory from something that was very arcane and abstract and radically skeptical to something that became more usable and concrete and actionable and less skeptical than dogmatic.
Yeah, I mean, this is what we've seen, and it's why quite a lot of the people, the academics who appreciated the first postmodernists, keep saying to us, this cannot be postmodernism. Postmodernism is a skepticism towards metanarratives, and what we are seeing right now is a very simplistic metanarrative about how race works, about how power works, about how knowledge works. This isn't really postmodernism, but I think that that argument can certainly be made. The first postmodernists, they were deconstructive. They wanted to take apart these systems which were sort of accepted as common sense and just sort of really dismantle things. It was the next lot, the people in the, people like Judith Butler, like Kimberly Crenshaw, in the 90s who wanted to rebuild. And so they said, we can't just keep pulling everything apart. We have to accept that some objective truth exists, some experiences. So the thing that is real is these systems of power and privilege. And that has gradually sort of solidified until you can see, if you were to read D'Angelo's White Fragility, you have terms of absolute certainty. She will say it is impossible to avoid being socialized into this. Absolutely, clearly, it's a fact for her.
Yeah, so let's go back to the roots of it a little bit and talk about that radical skepticism that was at the root of postmodern theory.
Yeah, so I think there was a crisis of confidence among left-wing intellectuals. There was a time in the 60s. It was a time of really profound cultural change. So the two world wars had finished. There was we'd seen the rise and fall of fascism and communism. The empire had fallen for the Brits and for other Europeans. And at the same time as this, there was a sort of rising youth culture, a popular culture that was now vying with high culture. There was mass production of consumer goods was happening, and there was feminism, gay pride, and the civil rights movement. So these changes where I think leftist intellectuals whose history had largely been Marxist were in this position of thinking, well, what can we rely on now? What can we believe that anything is true? Because Marxism had failed quite spectacularly, and so it was one of the targets of the first postmodernists. And when Lyotard described this as a general cultural phenomenon, that everybody was having a skepticism towards meta-narratives, I don't think they were. I think this was an intellectual thing, but he certainly is pointing at some quite rapid changes between about 1960 and 1980. It was
well, I think
it's revolutionary.
I think that's somewhat revealing, though, that their attitude was, well, if we can't believe Marxism, what can we believe? I mean, from a non-Marxist perspective, that seems a little nuts, but I think it indicates the degree to which Marxism was a faith among the intellectuals of the era, and that when that faith crumbled, they weren't prepared for what comes next.
I mean, I was simplifying that quite a lot, but yes, Marxism was the thing they looked at. They also looked at Christianity and at science and the whole idea of progress. And what they were looking at really was confidence in modernity. So Marxism was certainly one modernist approach to understanding the world. It believed in objective truth. It had a purpose. It believed that dialogue was valuable. So yeah, when that all sort of crumbled, I think that was the trigger, and so do quite a few people who've traced the sort of philosophical roots in the other direction. We really start in about 1968, but yeah, it certainly wasn't the only meta-narrative they wanted to deconstruct.
No, I'm interested also in the way of turning against science, and there's a sort of a trend that I've noticed, which is sort of like the revenge of the literary and humanities types against the sciences, because there's this sense that, oh, science had such enormous respect as a generator of truth, and it strikes me a lot of what's behind critical theory and not just that, but other similar ideas, is this idea of saying, no, we're going to break it down. So we're going to show science is just a bunch of literary narratives, just like what we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, this is what we're seeing quite a lot on social media at this very moment. There are criticisms of maths as a social construct, of
2 + 2 = 4.
Science. Yeah, science as I'm not even getting into that. As you know, my writing partner James Lindsay got very, very deeply into that. He is in fact a mathematician. I don't get into that because I'm rubbish at maths, but in the normal way, not in the way that requires being a philosopher. So I avoid that. But yeah, this is what has arisen really probably quite most strongly in post-colonial theory and queer theory. And those are the two that are most, that they retain the strongest elements of postmodernism. So if we look at somebody particularly like Michel Foucault, and he had this concept of biopower. And what he meant by that was that when we're looking at these knowledges that are constructed by powerful forces in society, what is at the top of that list of most respected knowledge? It is science. And so because he related power and knowledge so much that he coined the term power knowledge, and that was what he understood knowledge to be. He was extremely suspicious of science, and he referred to it as biopower. Now, there's a lot of reason.
Bio as in
biological
biology?
power.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So scientific discourses is really what biopower means. To him, but he's not entirely wrong. He looks back at history, and we see, he looks at the history of sexuality, and we see that homosexuality was regarded as a heinous sin. Then it was regarded as a disorder. Now it's a natural variation that some people are. So this isn't entirely wrong, but this isn't something that liberals or scientists or people who believe in an empirical truth have ever denied. That we tend to think that we can get closer to the truth, which the postmodernists are kind of radically skeptical about. They tend to look back and say, well, if we were wrong to believe this then, we're probably wrong to believe what we believe now. And that's the question that scientists ask as well. We cannot be sure that what we know now is the best way to look at things. In 100 years, people will look at what we thought now and think that it was wrong. But this isn't a reason to give up on trying to get closer to the truth. And if we measure ways in which we have got closer to the truth and the benefits this has had for humanity, you can see it's a worthwhile thing to do.
Well, I think the difference is that in a sort of a rational or scientific worldview, there's a recognition of the existence of bias, but bias is seen as being in contrast to the ability to be objective. Whereas in the postmodern idea, there's nothing but bias. Everything is bias. There is no objectivity to contrast it to.
Yeah, precisely. I sort of describe it as a scale. Really, if you take the sort of ideal pure postmodernist and the ideal pure scientist, they both accept that there's an objective reality out there, and they both know we can never be absolutely sure of having sort of grasped what it is. But yeah, whereas the scientist will sort of deal with this potential for human bias and human error by trying to build systems to minimize it to as much as you can and continue to try and find the truth. The postmodernists are much more interested in what the biases are and how they work, and theorizing according to their own ideology about what is happening here. That truth isn't really an aim.
See, I would take issue with the idea of a sliding scale. I think, there are obviously things that we can certainly know about the world if we look around us. Theory, the more theoretical and abstract something becomes, the more uncertainty you introduce that maybe you have abstracted it or theorized about it in the wrong way. So I'm uncomfortable with the idea of saying, oh, it's just a sliding scale. And because what they've done is they've basically said, you can never know anything.
Yeah, that's radical skepticism.
Yeah. So the other aspect of that is the idea of the power of language, and they make that central to that. The language basically shapes everything. It shapes your theory, it shapes your view of the world, and it actually shapes, I mean, they kind of dance around it, but they basically say language creates the world that you live in. And they say, well, it shapes your experience of the world. But what they really, since they have the radical skepticism of nothing being outside of that, they're basically saying reality creates, or language creates your reality. And I think that's how it ties into this obsession now with policing language. If that shapes reality, whoever controls language controls the world.
Yeah, I think this is at root what we're seeing. I think the scholars and the academics would try to make it more sophisticated than that, but that is what's at the root. And this is what we're hearing from activists. There is close reading of language. There's an assumption that particularly racist and transphobic power structures will be underlying everything, and a need to find them and fix them.
Yeah. I think that what you've sort of talked about in the book is this odd mutation from a radically skeptical system to a radically dogmatic system, which seems like opposites, but in a way they're not. That, you know, and there's one particular quote from the book that I thought really captured this, and it's quote, "Because of its rejection of objective truth and reason, postmodernism refuses to substantiate itself and cannot therefore be argued with." And I think it's interesting that, you know, if you have a radically skeptical view, you have a view that can't be refuted or argued with, and therefore it becomes dogmatic and authoritarian.
Yeah, this is how it works, and this, I think, is counterintuitive to people. They tend to claim that it is science and reason that is dogmatic and thinks it knows everything, while they have humility of accepting that nothing can be known. But that isn't. It actually sort of works in the opposite way to that, because the sort of objectivist standpoint really takes quite a humble view of never being completely sure that we know anything, of always trying to falsify things, of rechecking things. That is a skepticism. But if you're going with these, I mean, Lyotard referred to it as a paralogy of legitimation, and what he meant by that was having all these different little local narratives, and they are all equally true. So now, as it has evolved, it's gone much more into identity. So there will be the unique voice of color. There will be the voice of trans people. Listen to women of color. Listen to trans women. And there's this idea that we have different knowledges related to our identity and how they are understood to work in relation to power.
Yeah, that's something that interestingly came up in your book that got me to thinking, which is you talk about how they reject both the individual and the universal.
Yeah, I mean, this is the liberal humanist focus, which has been dominant for quite some time now, and which sort of underlay the civil rights movement and gay pride and liberal feminism of the 60s and 70s. And that focuses on the individual as someone who should have access to everything that society can offer and be able to fulfill his or her unique potential. So, you know, that's a big move away from sort of collectivist, socially conservative ideas of working within community, within families, and you know, that individual as the person who must have freedom and agency. And then we have the humanist idea as well, where everybody is essentially the same. We have a common human nature. We are a single group, and we can empathize across all kinds of divides and actually care about humanity as a whole.
Yeah, I think that it's kind of interesting how you have these, you know, it's like how the paradox that you could have a radically skeptical movement that then becomes authoritarian with rationality, or a rational worldview, a scientific worldview, or a scientific method as being the opposite of that. Same here, you have that kind of paradox where the individual and the universal might seem to be opposites, but actually those things go together, as opposed to this sort of identitarian or group oriented, small group oriented.
Yeah, I think we've got all these sort of different elements there which sort of manifest politically, but I think are largely a mixture of culture and nature. So, I mean, if you were to have pure individualism, then you have something like radical libertarianism. And if you were to have sort of pure humanism, then you have this kind of altruistic sort of commune thing going on. But if you have liberal humanism, then you have what we really have developed over the modern period, where we have the individual has freedom, the individual has rights, but we understand each other as all part of the same species, having the same human experience.
Well, being on the more libertarian end of the quote unquote libertarian end of that, I think that it's actually not that different from the idea of universal rights and a universal nature of man being compatible with individualism. I think that's actually part of the libertarian, or at least in my version of it, the libertarian worldview.
That the level playing field, yeah.
And well, and the idea that that we have common needs, and that trade and markets and the marketplace of ideas can bring us together in that common needs and common language. I think one of the great misconceptions of a sort of a pro-free market or individualist view is the idea that we're against cooperation, when we actually view private economy or an unregulated economy as a massive form of cooperation, just cooperation on different terms. But one of the issues I wanted to go on to here was is the thing we talk about, how the postmodern focus is on small groups and communities and sort of conformity to the values and ideas and worldview of those small groups or communities. It may be, as I was reading these descriptions, I started thinking, is the alt-right, this sort of, or the nationalist right that's been resurgent in America, and especially, if you're on Twitter, so you've seen them, is it postmodern in a way?
That's an interesting thing, because this is something else that we've been looking at as well. I don't think that the kind of white identity politics that we see, or the sort of insular nationalist ideas, are themselves postmodern, or even the skepticism of expertise that we also tend to see from the populist right. But I think that this is connected, because we've had this kind of mentality, I think, that we're seeing in postmodernism, this idea of language being extremely powerful, of humans existing in tribes with different knowledges. This is generally a human intuition. The whole sort of development of liberalism and science was actually quite counterintuitive. So if we've seen where we have postmodernists who tell us that we think in terms of science and reason by default, and we have to learn to focus instead on narratives and experiences, that's actually nonsense. We have always focused on narratives and experiences, and trying to hold on to an expectation that there will be evidence for truth claims, that there will be reasoned arguments, is much harder. So I don't think that postmodernism itself, this development on the left, has caused the issue on the right at the origins. I think this has always been there. This has been a human trait. Post-truth works like postmodernism. Alternative ways of knowing works like alternative truths. Yeah, there's alternative facts. So we're at a time now when you could call it an era of postmodernism, where it has become quite normal not to care too much if what you're saying is true, to care more about a satisfying narrative than the facts of a matter that can be established. So that's what we were calling the post-truth phenomenon. And I think postmodernism has certainly played into that a lot. But the best person for this, I think, is Matt McManus. He's an editor at Areo and one of our most popular writers, and he's published the book The Rise of Postmodern Conservatism, where he's looking at how this is working on the right. It's a very good read. I was skeptical of it, but I see how it all works in now.
My experience, especially arguing with people on Twitter and online, that sort of thing, is that, and you talk about a little bit about this in the book, about how the left and right kind of, or the nationalist or racist right and the postmodern left sort of feed off of each other in a way. And one of the things I see is that the white nationalist types, or the alt-right, or the more tribalist right, they will come in and basically say, they'll look at what postmodernists say and what the quote unquote anti-racists who are expressing these postmodernist views, they look at what they say and they say, well, see, look, they agree with us. So it's not so much that it caused them, but it almost validates them by presenting them with a mirror image or a negative image.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen Richard Spencer, is it, recently agreeing with Ibram Kendi, but yeah, with a different moral slant on it, and yeah, that this is not surprising. This is illiberalism, it is tribalism, and it does look pretty much the same, and we get a lot of the same kind of tactics as well. So when I've tried to when I wrote with Jim an argument for the inclusion of trans people, then I got a lot of people, I must stay in my lane, I'm not trans, I mustn't talk about trans issues, I mustn't talk about race issues because I'm white. And so much of this stay in your lane and stop talking over people. But then when I have criticized Trump, say on Twitter, I suddenly get a lot of American conservatives saying, you have no right to talk about this as a British woman, you know, stay in your lane, essentially. And we get the same kind of social constructivism going on as well. While we have you know, people on the postmodern left telling us that we're constantly reconstructing racist and sexist ideas with the way we talk about things, I get people on the right telling me that something like feminism has corrupted the minds of women and is now making them really unhappy. And so sometimes I find, particularly when it comes to the roles of women, that there's a kind of a battle going on from feminists who are claiming that women are being brainwashed with these ideas of domesticity and their own sort of roles as mothers, and then other people claiming that women are being brainwashed into feminism to having to go and work in cubicles. And you know, I think women have agency. We are individuals. Obviously, culture's a big impact, but I think we can evaluate our own lives.
And one of the things that everybody's, I think, has seen with, especially with Joanne Rowling and all that sort of thing, that there is, amongst the postmodern or amongst the woke set, because they divide everything up into little tribes and groups, they also have their own internecine tribal battles.
Yeah, and the big sort of the battle that we're seeing between the gender critical feminists and the trans activists at the moment is it's useful to kind of demonstrate the difference between the descendants of the Marxists and the descendants of the postmodernists. So because the Marxists were seeing everything in terms of oppressed and oppressor classes and a need to sort of raise consciousness and sort of dismantle these power systems. We see that in the radical feminists or gender critical feminists who see men and women as classes of people defined by their biological function. The radical feminism, it has its roots in Marxist ideas through Engels about working class men producing labor and working class women producing laborers. And this has kind of evolved into this sort of black and white. Men are people with penises, women are people with uteruses. And because of the history of this, men have been able to dominate women. So they cannot believe that trans identity is in any way a real thing. It has to be something that is entirely socially constructed, and also because of this kind of paranoid mindset, it is often conflated with patriarchy and men's rights activism to get into women's spaces. Now, the trans activists are coming very much from the postmodern point of view, from queer theory, and so they have a complicated belief that gender is both a social construct and absolutely real, and sex is actually probably a social construct as well, because we have decided that categories of men and women exist and are so titled because of biological essentialism. So they're coming from completely different places, and they're sort of firing at each other. And they're talking past each other completely. So that it is quite useful when people are saying, but surely this postmodern thing, this social justice, is just an evolution of Marxism. No, it's you won't understand it that way. Look at the radical feminists and you'll see what an evolution of Marxism looks like. Look at social justice and you'll see what an evolution of postmodernism looks like.
Well, I actually I'm on the side of the people who think that it is, in one sense, an evolution of Marxism, because when I see a lot of these things, and that's actually, you sort of begin you and James in the book begin the history of philosophy in the 1960s with the postmodernists, the rise of the postmodernists. When I look at it from a wider perspective, so for example, when you look at what's the connection between the postmodernists and, say, the alt-right or the nationalists, I think there's a line of connection that goes all the way back to the 19th century Romantic movement. This idea of rejecting Enlightenment reason and thinking that emotion and communities and tradition and group traditions are way much more important. There is an element there that's being drawn on almost by the postmodernists.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. We can certainly go a lot further back, but I think people like Steven Pinker and Hicks, Stephen Hicks, they've sort of looked at things in terms of Enlightenment thinking and counter-Enlightenment thinking.
yeah.
And in that case, the Marxists were Enlightenment thinkers; they were modernists, and the postmodernists are counter Enlightenment thinkers. But
Actually,
we're dividing.
I would disagree with that categorization of Marxists as Enlightenment thinkers, because I think there's a famous quote from Marx about the base and the superstructure. And it's the idea that the base of society is the economic relationships and the relationships of class, and the superstructure, by which he means anything relating to ideas and theories and religion and culture. That's this ephemeral thing built on top of the base. And it exists basically just to serve the base. It's all just a legitimating ideology. So I think that Marxist idea of anybody who disagrees with me is just, I don't have to really deal with the truth of their assertions. They're just providing a legitimating ideology for a system of oppression. That goes all the way back to the Marxists.
Well, I think the Marxists had a meta-narrative. They obviously Marx was very much influenced by Darwin, and he was looking at the way to produce sort of a species being to make humanity sort of grow into what it was intended to be. I really see the difference between Marxists and postmodernists as the Marxists believing in an objective truth, believing in modernism, believing in progress, and that there was going to be an evolution towards greater truth as being wrong, while the postmodernists are not even wrong, because they don't have that belief in truth in the first place, and they only have, if we're looking at what you were just saying about Marx, they only have the superstructure. There isn't this is a very different thing to saying, like we can, I think liberals as well, we can say that this is true. There is a material reality, and then there are ideologies that explain it. I don't think Marxism is the best one. If we wanted to look at the influences of Marxism on postmodernism, and we might actually do this, Jim and I are thinking of going back a little bit further and looking at more influences in detail, we see certainly some sharing of Hegel. So that's probably a common ancestor for both of them. We see this idea of false consciousness, which has kind of been turned within postmodern ideas to this critical consciousness, which is now sort of commonly known as woke. Right. And we have a number of similarities about the concept of a revolutionary sort of zeal. So I think we've got influences on the postmodern thought via Marcuse and the New Left into the sort of the Black Panthers particularly, so and the Black feminists. So this is where we still have this kind of revolutionary rooted in Marxist ideas that have come into social justice from its own very particular stream through the New Left, the Black feminists, critical race theory, intersectionality. So that's certainly there. And we also have from Gramsci the concept of hegemony, which is very much still a central part of social justice and was sort of foundational to the postmodern ideas as well. There's these dominant discourses and they win out. But if you're looking at the scholarship, you will not find them quoting Marx very much, or even the Frankfurt School. They are overwhelmingly quoting Foucault and then some Derrida and Lyotard, but that doesn't mean that there isn't still very much that spirit that's in there, and it reveals itself more in the activism than the scholarship.
Well, my experience with philosophers, including especially academic philosophers, is that they often are shockingly unaware of the deeper roots of, because they come in with a little tradition and talking to each other, talking amongst themselves with people who share a general sensibility, and they're often shockingly unaware of the precursors and roots historically of those philosophical views.
I find that I've been arguing with philosophers quite a lot. Mm-hmm. I find the opposite problem, really. I think they're trying to keep it in the pure realm of ideas, and they stop at around 1975 quite often. So they are then quite sort of confused by how I am saying that the current discourse analysis, the current understanding of power is postmodern. So we have these arguments in which what it reminds me of is when you're trying to address some kind of social problem that is, say caused by fundamentalist interpretations of Islam. If you were trying to look at, say, female genital mutilation, and this is an issue and you're trying to work out ways to address it, it's like when a sophisticated Islamic theologian comes in and starts referring you to the core text and what the Prophet actually meant. And while this is obviously important and interesting to people who believe in that faith, it's not really that helpful when we're looking at how the ideas have evolved and are being used in society on real people right now.
I think it is useful to, that I think you can also get too focused on the right now. And I find it interesting that you are looking at the deeper roots of this. And one of the things that jumped out at me in reading the book is that one of the deeper roots you want to look at is Immanuel Kant, because there's a whole number of statements here. Let's see, I wrote a couple of them. The idea that we are limited in our ability to know and must express knowledge through language, concepts, and categories. And Kant was really sort of the author. I think he's sort of viewed as an enlightenment, as one of the last of the great Enlightenment philosophers. I think he's the last for a reason, because I think he kind of killed it off. And what he specifically came up with is this idea that, well, there might be there's an objective reality out there, but we can't know it. Everything's filtered through our categories. And the mental categories we have in our mind shape everything we perceive. And now the difference between him and today is he thought, well, those categories are universal. All human beings share them, so we're all sort of sharing the same collective delusion. But I think I sort of view the 19th century as working out that implications of, well, no, it's not universal. Well, there's this group versus that group, and it's divided by class, or it's divided by, and then eventually it's divided by race, and race, class, and gender. And I think, in a way, I see the postmodernists as being the people who took that Kantian framework of we don't have contact with reality. All we have is contact with something shaped by our own mental categories. They've taken that idea to its farthest extreme, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, this is certainly what we're always seeing, a recycling, a sort of separating, a rejoining again of different ideas. Jim and I, we wanted to sort of draw a map of where everything comes from, and it really is so complicated, because we saw this sort of radical divide between Marxism and postmodernism. Then we can see bits of it sort of coming back together again within certain groups, and it's people are sort of taking bits from here, there, and everywhere. And most people haven't read the Philosophers or even the postmodernists, but these are currents that are in society. So at the same time that I'm criticizing postmodern discourse analysis, what I'm doing is discourse analysis, because I'm looking at how people are talking about things and how they are conceptualizing them, and trying to make this accessible to people who are seeing the symptoms of it but find the underlying thought counterintuitive and haven't really grasped it.
Right. Yeah, I think that the people underestimate the extent to which, John Maynard Keynes has this famous quote about how, about the practical man who is actually the slave of some defunct economist, right? Because he's taking the ideas of some economists that have been floating around in the culture and just using them and acting on them without ever having realized that that's what he's doing. And I think the same can be said that a lot of people are slaves of a defunct philosopher.
I think this is always going to be the case. I mean, when I looked at in my academic work, I'm looking at religious writing, and I've always been particularly interested in Augustine, because he was so malleable for both Catholics and Protestants to use in any way. But there really isn't any individual who has been more influential on the development of Western philosophy and Christianity, which were the two sort of main developments in the West. So there are people now, and you could ask them a number of questions. You'd find that they have a lot of common sense assumptions, and they'd have no idea that this came essentially from Augustine. So my fear at the moment is that Foucault could actually function in this same kind of way, and actually change the way people are thinking about things, because I can see some people have taken him off in one direction and some people have taken him off in another direction. But there are now people saying all kinds of things about not power, knowledge and discourses, and they don't know where it came from, but they really are channeling Foucault.
Right, exactly. No, that raises the question, we talk about how pervasive it's become. And that raises the question of, when you look at a phenomenon like that, where it grows from being relatively unknown to being extremely pervasive, it can go one of two ways. It can either come and take over everything and become the ruling dogma of a society, or you could look at it and think, well, maybe we've reached the peak. That it's the we're just at the peak of the fad, and this is about to fade out. And so I guess I would get your sense of where do you think we are with that?
I keep changing on this. What I thought was going to happen for quite a while is when we were doing our project where we were sending in papers to academic journals. And then after that, there was quite a lot of academics who wanted to distance themselves from the kind of scholarship we were criticizing.
Now, let's talk about that for Let's talk about that for a second. So you're talking about SoCal too, right?
Yes, as they called it, yeah. But we sent papers to journals which really are indistinguishable from the papers they were already publishing. So they shouldn't be embarrassed if they stand by that kind of work. That was what it was. But it did include some of the worst concepts, some of the worst impossible or really implausible data, and then drew conclusions that weren't even warranted from it. And we just used a lot of theory to argue for things that made no sense whatsoever, were unethical. So we got quite a lot of those papers in, but that was something we were trying to show people what was out there. And then a lot of academics who had been sympathetic to it were saying, no, there's still a lot of good empirical scholars, and there are. And so we were I was hopeful in a way. What I thought was likely to happen was that there would be a drawing away from it, that it had peaked and that people would move away and it wouldn't become a big crisis. And then everybody would say that Jim and Peter and me and all the others were having a big moral panic about nothing because it had died away, and oh well, we can deal with that. But that isn't what happened. And so with particularly the coronavirus making people anxious, I think making people want something to fight, then they're sort of withdrawing into their own spaces and getting in, spending most of their time with their online echo chamber.
Right.
And then the killing of George Floyd, that, it was like, light the touch paper, and what has been threatening, it's been bubbling up all over the place. I imagine it as this kind of toxic gas that is under the surface of society, and then it's bubbled up in places like Evergreen College, like young adult books, like the Ravelry Knitting Circle. It's come and sort of destroyed sort of sections of society, but most of the time it's just kind of bubbling under there. And then I think the combination of the coronavirus and the killing of George Floyd has just made it burst into what is really, in the US, really does seem to be an attempted cultural revolution.
Yeah, I think it's an attempted cultural revolution. I'm not sure how far down it proceeds, but I think the role of social media is important because, one thing I was struck by in years ago in the Thomas Kuhn, who wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and I don't know if you count him as a postmodernist, but there's a similarity there because he has this idea that scientific theories cannot really be settled by evidence or by experiments. They can't even be falsified by evidence and experiments. They're only really decided by social consensus. And he has a section late in the book, I remember, this really jumped out at me, a section late in this book where he says, well, my theory about how science works is itself something that will be settled and accepted by social consensus. So it's almost like there's sort of like a gang rule as a method of philosophy, right? If I can get a big enough group to go and back my ideology, then therefore we can act like we're entitled to act like it's true just because we have a group. And it strikes me that makes Twitter the perfect medium for this kind of approach to ideas.
Yeah, I think this is the human approach. I mean, when people have difficulty understanding how something can be considered true if it isn't the reality, I usually try to explain it by saying it's not that the postmodernists say that there isn't a reality, but that they say that the way we decide what is true decides what the reality is. So we can say that it is true that the Earth orbits the Sun because there is evidence that that is the reality. But the fact that we choose correspondence as reality as the model of truth, they would say is the cultural construct. If another culture used a religious narrative about the sun being a chariot driven across the sky by a god, then there isn't any grounds to say that that model of truth is less worthy than the correspondence with reality model of truth. So, this is, I think, how humans tend to think. We are above all storytelling animals. It would be great if we were actually naturally scientists, but we're not. And I think Jonathan Haidt is the best on this when he says we have an inner lawyer rather than an inner scientist. And he argues that we work on shared narratives because they have done best at keeping people alive rather than discovering the truth, which can sometimes be quite upsetting. So yeah, this is what we have. And now when we have social media where we can sort of attend a buffet and find other people holding the same truths, we can also simplify and bastardize the narratives and kind of swell them among our own echo chambers. I think, yeah, we're having a significant problem. Up until recently, I didn't agree that social media was a problem itself. I thought it was just a tool for accelerating the problem, but I've now come to believe that yes, this is actually changing the way we think.
Well, I don't know to what extent I kind of have to go back and forth on the same thing about is social media a disease or is it just symptom? But I do think that social media combined with the coronavirus has made it worse because people aren't getting out into the world as much to interact with people who are different from them. And it really does sort of put you into the bubble. But what I want to end on here, though, is talking about what is the answer to this. So you spend the last part of the book talking about a defense of liberalism as the answer to this.
I think there's going to need to be a lot more writing about what the answer is in a lot of different situations. We've looked at mostly what the answer is in terms of ideas, how we need to think about things in order to address the problem. So we think that urgently, we need to apply the rules of secularism to the critical social justice ideas. That is, they need to be something that an individual can hold, can express, and can live by, but not be imposed on anyone else. The problem we're having at the moment is that we're seeing these ideas as a universal sort of standard for equality, when actually it should be in the same category as a belief system like a religion. So that's something that needs to happen quite urgently. People shouldn't be having to write diversity, equity, and inclusion statements that draw on critical social justice ideas to get jobs any more than they should have to, recite the Apostles' Creed or anything like this. This is a specific approach to social justice, not social justice itself. In the longer term, I think we just need to beat the ideas. We need to be able to address them. We need to understand them as they are, and know how to argue with them. And that's essentially what our book is for. We want people who don't have any background in the scholarship to be able to grasp how it works, and also to then be able to articulate their own problem with it. Because a lot of people sense the problem. They feel that it's wrong, it's unethical, it's not consistent, and it's not rooted in reality, but it's difficult to get at. So that, I think, is the next step.
I think it's interesting too that liberalism you use in a broader sense, the one that would actually, and in some ways, because I would be considered on the right in America, but I've never described myself as a conservative. I've always said I would call myself a liberal if in America it meant, pro-freedom, which it doesn't necessarily mean in America. It has a very complicated history there. If liberalism embraced being pro-free market, which is more the case historically and around the world. So liberalism, I see, one of the interesting things I see emerging from this sort of critique of postmodernism, in your book, but also elsewhere, is a sense that there are liberal strains on the left and the right, and maybe we should be talking to each other and banding together a little bit more against the illiberal strains.
Yeah, I mean, the piece we wrote a great long manifesto called a Manifesto Against the Enemies of Modernity, James Lindsay and I. And what we're essentially talking about there is liberalism that can exist on both the left and the right. It's a respect for science, for reason, for plurality, for the marketplace of ideas. We didn't use the word liberalism because of the problem in America of people associating it with the left, whereas in Australia, people will associate it with the right.
Right.
And here in the UK, people tend to see it as a kind of status quo centrism.
Yeah. What do the Lib Dems stand for these days? Does anybody know?
No, they keep vacillating all over the place. I had hopes of them, but no more. But you know, when I'm talking about liberalism, I am talking about that philosophical concept of freedom, of the individual, of the universal, of meritocracy, and colorblindness, and you know.
I found it very interesting that you described liberalism as an intellectual system, not just a political system or an ethical system, but an intellectual system.
I mean, I think the best way to understand it is a system of conflict resolution. So it's not the solution to a conflict like Marxism is or like free markets are, but a system in which people can coexist. So you can have a lot of different beliefs. You can have Christians and Muslims, you can have conservatives and Marxists in a society, and there's a balance where nobody is allowed to impose their ideas on anybody else. And I think that's what makes liberalism fragile, because there isn't this kind of cohesion. We tend to be reformers rather than revolutionaries or reactionaries. And I think anybody who is a reformer and has these concepts of freedom and plurality and viewpoint diversity is what I'm talking about as a liberal. Now, I am not economically a liberal, so we'd argue probably quite severely there, but culturally I am. So that's why I call myself a left liberal, because I have leftist economic views and liberal social cultural ones.
Well, I think that, you know, that's emerging in my mind as a pretty solid base of at least being able to work together and interact and have conversations, which you cannot have with some of the more authoritarian or liberal types. So
yeah.
I think you're absolutely right about the need to understand this, so that to understand what's going on with postmodernism and with this rise of critical theory, so that we know how to answer it and can develop a sort of philosophical antibodies to it. And I think your book has been your James's book is a great, valuable addition to that. So we're running up against our time, so I want to thank you for coming on, and I look forward to trading with you in the marketplace of ideas, and maybe someday get you to embrace the other kind of marketplace.
So many people have tried that. I cause libertarians to despair, I'm afraid. It's been great talking to you, Robert.
Thanks for coming on. This is Salon of the Refused. My guest today has been Helen Pluckrose, editor of Areo magazine and co-author of the new book, Cynical Theories. If you like this conversation, you can follow us on YouTube. You can follow the podcast, which is available through Google Play and iTunes and elsewhere. If you find the ideas in this conversation interesting, you can also find more ideas and analysis at the Tracinski Letter, www.tracinskiletter.com. I'm Rob Tracinski. Thank you for listening.